So thank you for the introduction, and thank you also to the organizing committee for the invitation. It's very nice to be here. But also thanks to the interpreters and the photographer for the work that they've been doing during these past couple of days. So basically, the focus of this lecture is energy, and specifically renewable energy, in the context of so-called energy transitions. I know that many terrible things are happening right now in the world. We have genocide in Palestine, we have attacks on nuclear stations, we have wars, and the more, let's say, intensified concentration of wealth in the hands of the few. And that is, of course, aside from climate change and its effects already being felt by many across the world. And it's usually the disadvantaged and the impoverished that feel these effects very hard. So it might seem a bit counterintuitive to speak about renewable energy or energy transitions at this point. But I do think that it's one of the important discussions that we should have, not of course the only one, but one of them, because lately, during the past, let's say 2 or 3 years, there are increasing narratives about how nuclear energy, or that, let's say, nuclear energy, can contribute to the energy transition, which for me are very dangerous narratives. And on the other hand, conventional renewable energy development, I'll call it like this for now, and you will see why, and especially of large-scale projects, large-scale wind farms and solar parks, they are one face, let's say, of this global, violent, and alienating political-economic system, capitalism. So what I would like to talk about today, and I would like us to problematize with, is how we could form or can form renewable energy in radically different ways. So basically, beyond capitalism, in post-capitalist ways, and in post-human ways, meaning in ways that decenter the human as the only subject of justice. And also, how a radical form of renewable energy development could instigate broader socioecological change that I think is really needed today. But before we go into the what and the how, like what such a form of renewable energy development could look like, or what, practically, how could we do this, or in terms of strategies, I would like to discuss, even if briefly, the why. Why we need a radical form of energy development or renewable energy development. I think it's very important. I think it's very important to know what's not working and why. So we've all been hearing that we're in the midst of an energy transition, a transition away from fossil fuels and towards so-called renewable energy, or even towards other technologies or energy sources that are considered as carbon neutral, like nuclear energy that I mentioned earlier. And we've been hearing of its multiple benefits, not only, addressing climate change, but also, or maybe down to, how they can ensure energy security, which is basically a narrative that we've been hearing more and more following the war in Ukraine and the so-called energy crisis that, other lecturers talked about in the previous days. And in parallel, we've also been hearing that renewables have multiple benefits. Again, of course, from addressing climate change to contributing to economic growth and even to economic recovery, and how they can contribute to social equality, the reduction of energy poverty, and so on. But in fact, in reality, and I'm not the only one claiming this, the energy transition is a myth. there's no energy transition going on right now in the sense of shifting away from fossil fuels and towards so-called renewables or, other technologies promoted as carbon neutral. In reality, what we're experiencing are energy additions. And I'm borrowing the word additions from these two scholars that you see here under the graph because I think they're spot on. So energy additions in the sense that we keep adding new energy so-called sources or technologies to our energy mix to cover and facilitate increasing energy demand and consumption. And we can see this historically. If we look at this graph here, so basically this graph is from the 1800s until 2017, yes. So it depicts global energy consumption by so-called source in absolute quantities of energy. And I want to emphasize this because usually we're being shown graphs that support the narratives of renewables overtaking fossil fuels, and usually these graphs are in percentages. But different graphs and different metrics used in graphs tell different stories. And if we look at this graph, what we will see is that there was never a sustained decline in any energy technology or source, if you like, whenever another one was introduced, let's say, to the energy mix. And for me, claiming that we're having an energy transition right now is counterproductive because it prevents a genuine transition away from fossil fuels that we really do need. And it prevents real alternatives, and it also disabuses the many initiatives, I will talk about some examples later on, the many initiatives that we have across the world right now that are trying to materialize something different. And it disabuses alternative ways of knowing and being in the world and alternative practices. And if we look at this graph here, to see where we're at now, this graph is up until 2023. Again, you see the pattern that I mentioned earlier. But if we look at oil and coal, and what solar and wind are, and actually the absolute quantities, we will see, coal and oil are in the first place, and wind and solar, even with a tremendous penetration of large-scale or medium-scale parks across the world, they are very down below. So energy additions, I would argue, instead of energy transitions. And these energy additions are anything but just. By now, we have big, I would say, body of work in the social sciences, including in political ecology, that tells us that that renewable energy development, and especially of large-scale wind parks and solar parks, is accompanied by a whole sort of injustices and violences, not just for humans, but also for other species. I like to call them embodied, let's say multi-species injustices and violences that actually we can see throughout the whole supply chain, throughout the whole process of forming renewable energy. Injustices, not just at the place, where wind parks operate, but also far away from these places. Injustices and violences that come from the extraction of elements for building, wind turbines and solar panels, like rare earth mineral extraction in China and Inner Mongolia, in the Congo and in South Africa, where marginalized workers and children are extracting these materials to the detriment of, not only, but to the detriment of their health. Numerous injustices, technology manufacturing, usually being done in China, but also in Europe, like in Germany, where marginalized workers, not good working conditions, injustices that we can, and violences that we can see at places where large parks operate, land grabs, and implications for the livelihood of local groups, impoverishment and marginalization through land grabs. These are just some examples. Of course, I can't go through all of them because of time. Injustices that go down to, the disposal of technology. Again, usually these are dumped, let's say, turbine blade waste and panel waste. These are being dumped in the global south. Creation of toxic pollution and children, again, processing these materials. And I do think that with the increasing introduction or deployment, if you like, of AI technologies in renewable energy development, for renewable energy development, we will be seeing new injustices, types of injustices, but also more intensified ones. And these problems, they're not problems of some poor planning, let's say, some mistakes of some poor planning, or if you like, problems that we can solve through further techno-managerial adjustments, because they're wedded to basically what we call accumulation by dispossession. They're wedded to land grabs. They're wedded to extractivism or to colonialism or neo-colonialism, and basically an unequal world economy. So arguably, when we're talking about, large-scale renewable energy development, at least, for large-scale, there's nothing renewable, I argue, here. There's nothing sustainable other than, renewing capitalism and all the violences that it entails. Now, because of the many problems that large-scale parks have, many people, and academics also, they place their faith, let's say, on community renewable energy. Projects that, in which local communities have, let's say, a high degree of ownership or and control. These types of projects do, of course, have comparable advantages over large-scale projects. They can be a vehicle for the self-determination of local communities, helping them with their autonomy or empowering them. The processes, that we have observed are more democratic. I mean, when we're talking about bottom-up approaches rather than top-down. And there are benefits that we have seen, but we have also seen problems. And I'm not saying this to criticize, the well-meaning efforts of people on the ground trying to, do something different to decentralize renewable energy development or, trying to escape energy poverty. I'm not mentioning these problems, the ones that I will mention now for this reason. I just think that we should go further. And if you like, the point of this whole lecture is how we can go further than this. We have seen problems. We have seen problems in terms of, access to these projects and participation for, the less fortunate, the impoverished. We have seen grabbing of control by large actors or conforming to hegemonic structures. Different kinds of problems. So it highly depends. It's not that if a project is being done by a community that is necessarily more progressive, I would say. So the point for me is not to make supposed energy transitions more just, because under capitalism, they can't be just. The point for me is to shift away, to move away from capitalist renewable energy development, whether that's fossil fuels or renewables, and to radical forms of renewable energy development beyond capitalism. But of course, the question is how? How can we do this? Or how can we think about this? And of course, I don't claim that I have the answer. And actually, I don't believe there's one answer, one alternative, and so on. fits very well with the monism of capitalism. It fits very well with this neoliberal logic that there's no other alternative other than the one currently being promoted. And it fits well with, you know, as I said earlier, concealing and disabusing alternative ways of thinking and being in the world, you know, that capitalism does very well. Now, but I do think that there are many things we can do. There are many things, many ways we can invent, and many ways, you know, we can experiment. But before, let's say, we go down to the more practical issues or strategies, what kind of strategies we can use, I think there are two important issues that we need to think about differently. Two fundamental issues that if we don't, let's say, get down to them, that we have lost the game from the beginning. Which basically, what I'm trying to argue for is, you know, starting from different points, asking different questions, and on what it is that we're actually aiming for. Because for me, this is very important, because we know that technology is not neutral. It's not like we have a technology and it could be used in either good or bad ways. No, technology, political purposes are inscribed in the development of a technology. So what I'm trying to say is seeing what is thinking, what we're trying to do and for what reason, and then trying to figure out what kind of a technology will fulfill this reason and not the other way around. So first, for me, and no matter how abstract this might seem, it is important to acknowledge a common world, a common more than human world, a world that is not only inhabited by us, but also by other species, and that other species also have feelings, and they have agency, and that we have intimate relations with them, but also, you know, with other people as well. So that we become in common, that we form together worlds with other species. And I think that this lets us, let's say, form this understanding, helps us form a different kind of ethics and a different kind of politics. One based on care for others, based on affect, and based on commoning. I've probably heard the word commoning before, or the commons. I prefer to talk about commoning rather than the commons. Because conventionally, when we hear about the commons, we think about, you know, a resource or a thing to be managed, or even a set of rules, you know, to govern something. But for me, commoning drives our attention towards the process of governing or negotiating, let's say, something. So because I'm inspired by Gibson and Graham in this, and others like Massimo De Angelis and Bolle, so I kind of understand, let's say, commoning as a process, as a relational process of forming common value, basically. Common value, not just for humans, but also for more than humans. A process that involves, you know, negotiating access, responsibility, care, and so on, non-hierarchically. And commoning, I would say, is inherently more than human because, as Anna Cheng reminds us, multiple species make worlds. And the second key thing I believe that is worth talking about and reconsidering is how we understand energy, and specifically renewable energy. The ontology of energy, if you like. What is energy, or what is renewable energy? When we tend to think of energy, again, as a resource, or as a thing, or an abstract thing, there's this abstract notion to it, or as a commodity, you know, to be exchanged, or as the ability to do work. But if we think about it, if we think how we got such an understanding, this is the hegemonic understanding of energy, you know, that I just mentioned. But if we think about it, how we got such an understanding of energy, we'll see that this, hegemonic understanding of energy, the ability to do work, and so on, it goes back to the development of thermodynamics in the 1800s, and also to imperialism and colonialism, and subsequently industrial capitalism, the formation of industrial capitalism. Kara Duggett, and this is her book on the birth of energy, and also Larry Lohman have done great work to show how thermodynamics was a political project of capitalist society, without which colonialism and imperialism would not be possible, without which industrial capitalism would not have been possible, the plundering of the human and more than human world, the appropriation of the commons, if you like, would not have been possible without thermodynamics and this understanding of energy as the ability to do work that it, let's say, formed and propagated and installed. But if we think about it, renewable energy, like the wind, the sunlight, so-called biomass, waves, and so on, they're not resources. They're just elements of the web of life. So what I'm trying, actually, Karl Polanyi would have called them fictitious commodities because they were never formed for, to be incorporated in the market, despite of them, being incorporated in them. So what I'm trying to argue for is seeing renewable energy differently, not as a resource that we can use without it being depleted, that it can be replenished faster, that it can be depleted, or as the ability to do work. And of course, we can never know really what energy is. I completely agree with Richard Feynman is a very famous physicist. I'm sure you've all heard of him. But I think that rather than seeing energy as a resource or ability to do work, seeing it as relations between species, different species, across space and time, relations from multi-species living in a specific area towards or up to international agreement, relations and entanglements between different species that utilize, let's say, the fast repeating cycles and processes of the earth, of life, for socioecological reproduction, helps us see the entanglements, helps us see these relations, and it helps us see that these relations currently that we're nourishing by the way that we form renewable energy are alienating ones, are exploitive ones, are violent ones. But I do believe that we could speak and we could form such relations in effective ways, in ways that, demonstrate what I was saying earlier about care, about creating common value. And speaking, of a common, more than human world, of seeing energy differently, or, caring relations, I hope it doesn't seem too, let's say, idealistic to some or too abstract. Because indeed, across the world, first of all, we do have what we call relational ontologies. Basically, socioecologies, or to put it like very simply, communities that live relations, interrelations with other species based on care and based on affect. And relational ontologies that do see energy and renewable energy differently. And some of them connect and have formed initiatives, and I will mention an example in just a bit, on renewable energy based on such conceptualizations or ontologies that they have. And we do have across the world many practices and relations, as we heard earlier, that are not capitalist or anti-capitalist, if you like. To bring in Gibson and Graham into this, our economies are diverse. We have economic spaces in which relations are negotiated non-hierarchically, relations of, interdependence. So community economies by Gibson and Graham, just to give the term. And we do have initiatives on the ground right now on renewable energy, but not just on renewable energy, that are trying to do something different. They're trying to materialize something different. And I do want to mention a couple of examples. I don't wish to romanticize, let's say, these initiatives, because of course they may have their, contradictions. We can find contradictions everywhere, basically. But I do want to mention some examples to show, that what I'm talking about is not some abstract thing or, what we would like to do idealistically and so on. But the things are happening on the ground, no matter the contradictions and no matter how close these initiatives are to what I'm trying, to argue for here. So in New Zealand, there are Maori tribes, iwi tribes, that own or co-own large geothermal plants and micro photovoltaic, let's say, projects, very small ones. And, they form energy for self-consumption in most cases, form and consume, let's say, energy for their energy needs. But also they do sell energy. But rather than stressing commodification, what they stress is relationships, interrelationships. So basically, their whole conception, if I can put it like that, is forming renewable energy to enhance the dignity of humans and other species, what they call mana, but also to enhance what they see as a life force that permits all existence, what they call Maori. So a completely different understanding, of energy and of the purpose, let's say, of forming renewable energy than conventionally. And another initiative I want to mention is the one that you see here on the right, wind empowerment. So basically, this is a global network of people and also of organizations that are involved in manufacturing small-scale and open wind turbines, building on Pigot's efforts on wind turbines. I'll show you a Pigot wind turbine in the next slide. And another one I want to mention is Hegemonic. Hegemonic is basically the first energy community in Greece. It was formed in 2021, so quite recently. It's also a member of the Rescoup Federation, of energy communities. So Hegemonic is a cooperative, basically, and 53 households and small businesses are involved in it, mostly households, like 90% is households and 10%, let's say, small businesses. And they have two small photovoltaic stations, I would call them, because they're not big. They're like 200 kilowatt both. One is on a roof and the other is on, on land. And they, produce energy to consume. So it's for presumption, we call it presumption, production and consumption at the same time. And they do other kinds of actions. And they're in the first stages of development. Other, let's say, steps are foreseen. Right now, they're renovating a traditional water mill for electricity production. And Hegemonic was formed, under or with the help, let's say, of the P2P lab that you see here. So the P2P lab is a research collective that is concerned with enacting and actualizing commons-oriented futures. So they do different kinds of actions. They do capacity building, but they also do participatory action research. And Hegemonic is one part, let's say, of this. So I'm mentioning these examples, again, not to romanticize them, but to show that things are happening on the ground and that we can draw inspiration from them, learn from them, learn about the challenges that they have faced. And I will tell you a bit later about some challenges as well, from Commonin especially. Yeah, to learn from them and draw inspiration from them. Now, under this overall lens, let's say, of creating common value that I've mentioned, of community economies, anti-capitalist relations, and so on, we can think of community economies experimenting basically with forming energy, owning, forming renewable energy, but problematizing, I would say, and to problematize, with the elements and their layout, but with the aim of challenging profit, of challenging capitalist axioms and human exceptionalism and so on. Like for instance, when we think about scale, why not small-scale renewable energy development and consumption at the same time for covering community needs, but needs understood relationally to others, for reducing energy demand and consumption, but also for less materials, less extractivism, if I can put it like that, or even medium scale consumption with. It could be even the sale of remainder energy not used, but sale not profit-oriented, oriented towards, building a commons-based economy. For instance, with earnings that could be allocated across the supply chain, or to other radical initiatives, and even, to members, of a community economy for living well. But again, living well understood in relation to others and to the needs of others as well. Not only humans, but also more than humans. Or when we think about technology, why not open technology produced locally with local materials for opposing extractivism? Like you see here, this is a wind turbine based on the Pigol, let's say, initial open design. Why not such wind turbines to oppose extractivism and the colonialism as well that it entails? I won't go through all of them because I don't want to tire you, but I'm just trying to show some examples of the way that we can think about forming energy differently, from a lens that supports commoning. Or when we think about infrastructure, what infrastructure to use? Why not autonomous microgrids, like microgrids that are not connected to central grids, to avoid all the problems that these central grids have, and forming P2P networks, between microgrids, and forming common pools of energy that can be shared amongst, a cooperative. Why not a cooperative? There are more democratic, forms of enterprises. They can allow, let's say, for mechanisms for poor individuals and households to be involved without giving capital. So yeah, why not a collective, let's say, ownership of microgrids and common pools of energy with shares of energy shares, to be allocated based on care and on the needs of households. Or even if we want to think of this through the lens of, commons-based peer production, even larger, let's say, microgrids, peer-to-peer grids between neighboring, let's say, microgrids that you see here in the first picture. So what I'm saying is basically technically feasible. I'm not saying something that is technically feasible. There has been research on these issues, for instance, of peer-to-peer networks by Vasilis Kostakis and Yotitas and others. So it's not that it's not technically feasible. But of course, I'm not saying we have the answers for everything. Okay? Yeah, and I want to refer to another one, which I think is very important and many people might be wondering about. What about funding? Especially how can people that can't afford, to enter such a cooperative, how could they be involved, let's say? I think that crowdfunding platforms, that support the commons, like, I don't know if you heard about it, like Joteo, are, let's say, good options for raising money in areas or in places and for people that do not have the means to, enter such projects, even if they want to. Yeah, and okay, I might have talked about, some practical aspects, but which of course are not really practical. They're highly political, but I'm calling them practical now, to differentiate between things. But there's also the question of, how we can do this in terms of strategies. So I think that one important thing is, and we've mentioned this a couple of times, during the previous lectures, is alliances. Alliances, not just, with other initiatives on energy, not just other cooperatives, let's say radical, renewable energy development in other places, but alliances with many different kinds of radical initiatives, like initiatives on food, like a social movement supporting minorities or against social categories of difference, like against race and gender and so on. It could be a farmers' collective or cooperative and so on. So different kinds of, alliances between different kinds of initiatives for basically revolutionary connections, I would say. I think alliances are very important for scaling out, let's say, such or a different radical form of renewable energy development. Scaling out and not up. And when I say scaling out, I mean more and more and more of these kinds of projects or experiments, if you like, spread out rather than bigger and bigger and bigger, projects. But I think that alliances are also very important for, nourishing broader change. Alliances, I like to call them rhizomatic alliances. I have put a picture here. I hope it's not, I say, too difficult to get around to. But alliances, let's say, in a sort of a network, when everything connects to everything, initiatives, ideas, and so on, with this whole, let's say, community, this whole rhythm of commoners, if I can put it like that, engaged in experimentation beyond hegemonic ideas, beyond axioms, capitalist axioms, beyond, already defined solutions for already defined problems and so on. And for me, there's another thing which usually we don't tend to think about it as a strategy, or most of the times we kind of sideline it, and that's learning. But learning in a different way. Again, you see the word rhizomatic here. I couldn't resist, I'm sorry. Learning, this whole community, as I mentioned, of allied initiatives and ideas, basically being the living curriculum, learning as we go, evaluating as we go, evaluating in common, to figure out not only next steps, what works, what doesn't work, and so on. So a different form of learning that is basically experimental and experiential. So learning as an embodied practice and action. And here we have the question of the state, an issue that also came up in other talks, which I think, of course, is very important when we're talking about strategies. Now, what should the state play a role in radical renewable energy development, like post-capitalist one, or should it not? Do we want the state? Do we not want the state? Or some sort of state engagement? In academia, but also aside academia, but also in political ecology, there are very different understandings about the state, about what the state is, what its purpose is, or if we want it, if we should evade it, fight it from the outside or from the inside. And many people and academics believe that the state always oppresses, always creates violence by necessity, that it does these things, that by necessity it enforces capital accumulation, wars, and so on. And that in that sense, we should evade it or fight it from the outside and not engage with it, when it has to do with radical initiatives. Rita touched upon this earlier. My understanding of the state is a bit different because I'm inspired by Nikos Poulantzas and Bob Jessup as well. And what Nikos tells us is that the state is basically an outcome of struggles. It condenses relationships, forces that are the outcomes of social struggles. And basically, he also tells us that the orientations that states take, and their unity also, is basically formed through state projects, which are the political agendas of specific groups of actors. And Bob Jessup also tells us that the overall, let's say, states crystallize the interests of specific, actors based on their past victories in social struggles. So he calls it strategic selectivities. So in this sense, I do think that engaging with the state carefully, though, in such kinds of projects could be valuable. It could be valuable, not only for the initiatives themselves, for finding or stealing, if you like, allies from the state, but also for facilitating further commoning practices and instigating change in these strategic selectivities of states. So as to be able to impact, some change. And I'm not talking about here about, co-forming or co-owning projects together with the state. So basically what I have in mind, let's say, and others also, not just me, is what we call public common partnerships, in which the state can act as a partner for further commoning practices. And I think that there are many things we can think of here, like it could be innovative programs, educational programs, for local communities, in partnership with local government. Or it could be other things. And since I mentioned local government, I want to say that, as we come down to less centralized levels, with regards to the state, at least in theory, there's much more autonomy, like local governments have more autonomy, at least in theory. So I've said a lot of things, I've made a lot of proposals, and as if, what I'm saying can solve everything and that we have an answer for everything. Oh, let's do this, let's do that. Or, of course, what I'm saying is not prescriptive. It's up to, to communities and people helping communities, like working professionals or, allied researchers, to experiment, with these issues in different ways. So I've mentioned a lot of things, as if, we can cover everything. But there are many challenges, of course. There's a whole sort of challenges that even initiatives that are not close to what I'm describing, in this lecture are facing. Maybe economic challenges, that have to do with, finding the appropriate technology, even if we want a specific kind of technology. Challenges with, the institutional and regulatory framework. For instance, I was talking about common earlier, the cooperative in Greece. I was in a webinar, seminar, sorry, with a key person involved in, a key researcher involved in forming Common, and he was saying that it was so difficult to even, license the project and get it up and running, despite the fact that there was already a law about energy communities in Greece. Of course, they were the first to, let's say, use this law, but then again, he was saying how hard it was, and that they also probably had different ideas in mind before, getting to, starting to see how to license it, what to do, and, materials, where to get materials from, and so on. But they were saying that let's get it up and running, and then we'll see how we can build from there and, change things to actually, come closer to their initial motivations. So a whole sort of challenges. But I do believe that there are things we can do. Again, not for everything. I don't want to go, again, I don't want to tire you with too many things because I know everybody's tired and wants to go to lunch. But I just want to say that I think it's very important to, support existing initiatives and to support communities that might want, to do something different radically but don't have the means. Support them economically, support them to alter, the unequal power relations that they're involved in. This could be in terms of information, of giving expertise, information, and so on, or even helping them, to find allies and so on. Or, as most of us here, are researchers, with participatory action research that many wonderful people are actually doing on the ground right now. And it goes without saying that, contestation and what we talked on Tuesday, I think, about protests and advocacy is very important. Demanding change, for instance, has to do with, regulatory frameworks that might not exist in some countries or might be very unfavorable, to these kinds of initiatives. And building alliances, I think Rita also mentioned this, building alliances between, different kinds of social movements for contestation targeted, at central, local, or regional governments. Yeah, so to wrap this up, this whole thing that, I've tried to argue here, for me, it's not just about forming renewable energy in different ways, that are more just, say, for humans and more than humans. But it's more or less a revolutionary praxis, but not a violent one. A revolutionary praxis that basically challenges, as I mentioned earlier, capitalist axioms of growth, green growth, and so on, even social categories of difference, and oppressive systems. And I think that it does have, potential, and all these initiatives that, we can find across the world, to, transform beliefs and subjectivities and to instigate some broader change. There are many challenges to shifting away from capitalist energy development, but I am hopeful, to be honest, because I see that there's so many initiatives and, across the world that are actually trying to do something different. And so many people, whether that's researchers or, in other professions, that are actually trying to help with these issues and make a difference. So I do think it's, let's say, valuable to stay with the trouble, as Donna Haraway urges us to do.